Would you notice if someone stole half your money? Would you be mad? Would you notice if it happened over 20 years? Would you put up with it if you knew it was happening? Well, that's exactly what's happening to you right now, right in front of your eyes. Inflation is the government stealing your money. Every time there's inflation, that's the government stealing your money. Shemai guys, and welcome back to the Life to the Full podcast, the podcast that helps you make the most of your time here on Earth. I'm your host, Dav Morse, and I'm here to shine light on areas of your life that you didn't even realize you needed to think about. I'm here to encourage you to get financially fit, physically fit, emotionally fit, relationally fit, and spiritually fit. I've got a confession to make. I stopped watching the news a long time ago. It doesn't serve me to be constantly filled with negativity about things that rarely impact my life that I have no control over. But I recently downloaded X. I'm just wondering if anytime you say X, you have to say formerly known as Twitter. I feel like I see that everywhere. X, formerly known as Twitter. Anyway, I downloaded X in an attempt to hone my short-form writing skills. And boy, is it a cesspool of hatred and misery. I've noticed YouTube getting worse from the point of view of serving more and more polarizing videos, and Facebook has turned from a place where I could see what my friends are up to a source of wisdom or help of the crowds, into a place where I'm served a ton of groups or reels of things I have no desire to watch. First, top happiness tip of the day is to remember to touch grass. Maybe spend time with real people, because people aren't as mean and angry in real life, for the most part. Why do I start like this? Well, one of the things that people, certainly here in the UK, like to moan about is the cost of living crisis and how prices are becoming increasingly unaffordable. And the only way that you'll ever own a house is if your parents help you. The wealth gap is growing. Inequality is increasing. And there is seemingly no way to stop it. Soon, they say that if your parents don't own a house to give you, you'll never own one. And there are a number of things to address here, but I want to focus on one in particular. Why is inequality increasing? And is there any answer? But first, we need to understand one thing. What is money? Why not, just as a fun game, ask your friends that question? Sounds like a top evening out to me. What is money? Now, these are some of the answers that I've heard from various people. Money is a way to store your energy. Money is your life energy. Money is power. Money is control. Money is a philosophical concept. Money is the biggest confidence trick of all time. Now let's travel back in time to a time before we had money, in the way that we know it. If we grew carrots and we wanted a new saddle for our horse, we needed to have a coincidence of needs, which meant that we had to find someone who could give us a saddle, but who also wanted carrots. If we wanted a little bit of sugar, but all we had to exchange was a cow, then we ran into a problem, because it turns out to be not so easy to give a little bit of cow in exchange for a little bit of sugar. Unless we have a coincidence of amount, the cow needs to be divisible for this exchange to work. If we wanted Whitstable oysters, then we'd have to take our cow to Whitstable to make the exchange. Not that easy. Whitstable is a long way. Now, the concept of money was invented to address the problem of the coincidence of needs, the coincidence of amounts coincidence of location that we accounted above. If we all agree to use this thing called money, then we can bypass all the need for coincidence. Which leads us to the next property of money. It not only needs to be divisible, transportable, a store of value, but it also needs to be acceptable. The reason that you accept pounds or dollars in exchange for the work that you do is because you believe that the next person you need to give your fiat pound tokens to will accept them as payment for whatever it is you want. Food, clothing, computer gadgets. Money works on a trust basis. If we trust our government, then we are highly likely to accept the money that it issues. It's certainly not the case all over the world, where some government-issued money is practically worthless. In places as far-flung as Lebanon, Cambodia, Argentina, Kenya, Zimbabwe, people will rather have US dollars than the local currency. There's an amusing Reddit thread full of stories where Americans have turned up places like the UK and Australia and expected to be able to use their dollars. But I don't want to laugh too much at that today. Money is an invention that addressed these needs. But there's one more thing that is vital to use anything as money. And this is the thing that links to inequality. Money has to be scarce. There's a reason that we don't use leaves for money. It's because you can pretty much go anywhere and pick up armfuls of leaves. If a money isn't scarce, it can't hold its value. If you can always print more of it, it's not scarce. If there's too much of it, it loses its value and its usefulness as money. Who gets to create it? Money is created by governments and rulers across the world and national banks, local banks. The kind of money we use that is issued by governments that isn't backed by anything is called fiat money. Fiat means let it be so, or it's decreed so. That's why I call pounds fiat pound tokens, to remind myself that these bits of paper and coins are only made-up tokens that have value because the government says they do. This hasn't always been the case. Money in both the UK and the US, as well as other countries, used to be backed by gold, which means that any government money issued had to be redeemable for gold. This ensured that the individual wasn't tied to using a single government currency. They could exchange it for gold, and that would be acceptable all over the world. And the governments had to make sure that they had enough gold to give to people if they were going to issue this money. By creating money and requiring their citizens to pay taxes in the government currency, governments are essentially monopolizing money. They are exerting their power as the creator of money in order to have an element of control over their citizens. After all, he who controls the money controls the people. If a monetary system is not backed by a hard asset like gold, it is a soft money system. Up until 1931, in the UK, you could still swap pounds for gold. In 1971, in the US, the gold standard was completely abandoned. So, who benefits from a soft money system? It's got to be someone, right? Well, people who want loans. If you want to borrow money, the fact that banks can create loans just by typing a few numbers on a screen is incredibly helpful. People don't believe me when I tell them that all money is just numbers typed on a screen by someone in the bank. But you can just search for Bank of England, how money is created, and you'll see it right there on the Bank of England's website. I've left a link in the show notes as well if you just want to click on that. It jars with people because they think, I work so hard for my money. How can it be that someone just types it in on a screen? Rob Dix has got a great book that goes into more detail on this called The Price of Money. I'd recommend checking it out. The reason that they can do this is because of a thing called fractional reserve banking. The TLDR on this, because I've got a feeling this podcast might get a little long, is that if you think, like I used to think, that banks take money from depositors and then use this to lend to people that want to borrow money, then you'd be wrong. It may have been the way things worked once upon a time, but no longer. Fractional reserve banking came about when bankers realized that not all depositors wanted their money back at any one time. So they could issue debt, i.e. loans, for more than the value of the money that they held, because they would bet on not everybody would want their money at the same time. For example, if in 1971 I deposited £1,000 at HSBC, although it might have been called something else back then, Midland Bank is what I used to use when I was a child. I wasn't born in 1971, but, HSBC could, if I deposited £1,000, then lend out £8,000 because the fractional reserve requirement was 12.5%. But by now, as far as I can tell, there is no limit at all to the amount of money that a bank can create. Banks can literally give loans to people by typing a number on a ledger. I can't possibly imagine what could go wrong in such a system, and I'm sure that no one would gamify the system to benefit themselves. There are two types of loans, two types of debt. Loans that are made to people who buy stuff that go down in value and have no end value, like cars and foods. That is bad debt. And loans that are made to people who buy stuff that goes up in value, like houses or businesses. I would classify that as good debt. Now, all the creating of money that happens mean that there's more money in the system, and that leads to inflation. If you've ever thought, like I used to, that inflation is the rise in price of goods and services over a period of time, then you'd be forgiven because that's what most textbooks say it is. But invariably, it's actually the value of your pound or dollar that has gone down. There's loads more I could say on that, but that's for another day, mostly. Inflation leads to asset prices going up, which is good for people who own assets and bad for people who don't own assets. Because not only are they missing out on increases in asset prices, but they're also making assets more expensive to buy. This leads to inequality increasing. If the people who buy assets with loans let the price of their assets go up and get more loans to buy more assets, then guess what's going to happen to inequality? The biggest benefactor of soft money system, though, is the government. Not only do they get to print money to pay for stuff, they are also in the most debt of anybody in the nation. What is the most indebted thing? The government. Which means that as inflation is going on, the value of the debt that the government holds is decreasing. More on this as well another time. If you've got any questions, hit me up on Instagram, David Morse or Life to the Full podcast. I'd love to do a listener question episode. So let's recap. If a government can print money, the money mostly goes to people who own assets, the people that are closest to the money creation. The more inflation and money printing that goes on, And since 2008, the Bank of England has printed £875 billion, and almost £500 billion of that was during the COVID pandemic. The more inequality grows between those that own assets and those that don't. Pay attention to this, because we'll come back to this later. With all this printing of money, do you have any idea what it's doing to the value of your work and savings? Would you notice if someone stole half your money? Would you be mad? Would you notice if it happened over 20 years? Would you put up with it if you knew it was happening? Well, that's exactly what's happening to you right now, right in front of your eyes. Inflation is the government stealing your money. Every time there's inflation, that's the government stealing your money. All this money printing leads directly to the value of our pound decreasing. In fact, the pound has lost over half its value since 2000, and 99.647% of its value since 1751. If you want to see the effect of inflation on your money, check out in2013dollars.com. I'll have to link in the description. Let me tell you a story about a chap that I worked with. He recently retired, so he's in his mid to late 60s, and he was telling me that when he was at university, a pint of beer cost 22 pence. Yes, that's right, 22 pence. He noticed the price creeping up. He used to be able to get 4 pints for £1, which is absolutely madness. He says he had a friend who noticed that the price was going up, and he said, "Eric, if there ever becomes a day where I can't get 2 pints for £1, I'm going to stop drinking completely." And, of course, there came a day where you couldn't get 2 pints for £1, and actually he didn't stop drinking, he just carried on anyway. But that's not the point. The point is that it used to cost 22 pence for a pint of beer. Eric said he used to go out with a £5 note in his pocket, and that would usually last him 2 weeks worth of drinking. And now, £5 won't even get you 1 pint in most places. It's not that things are getting more expensive, but it's the value of our money being eroded away. We just can't buy as much stuff with our money. Now, this should be clear to us, but it often isn't because we don't think about it. With the advancement of technology, of farming, of food production, of pretty much anything you can think of, things should be cheaper because life is easier to produce these things. It is easier to produce food than it ever has been in the history of the world. So it should be cheaper, but it's not. It's the number that keeps going up. Talking of inequality, actually I saw a graph this morning showing how since 1971, when the US came off the gold standard and could print all the dollars they wanted, the gap between incomes has fanned out dramatically. Up until 1971, yes, of course you have income gaps between the richest and the poorest, but they were so much narrower. It looked like just a single line, just a little bit blurred because there was 4 lines really close together. But as soon as the money wasn't backed by anything, inequality grew massively. It doesn't have to be the case that it's a government that creates the money. Here's a little extract from Bangor University's website on the creation of a different form of money from over 200 years ago. Towards the end of the 18th century, the coinage of Britain was in a deplorable state due to the severe shortages of silver and copper coins. During the Industrial Revolution, people migrated from the countryside into mining and manufacturing centres. But living in towns required money, and the ability to pay wages was impossible for business without small change. With an influx of new workers using money, new shops were opened to meet demand, creating more jobs that required payment in coins. Although the production of counterfeit coins was illegal and punishable by death, it was not illegal to produce tokens with other designs which could be used instead of coins. The first great era of token production, during the First Industrial Revolution, began in 1787 with the issue of the Paris Mining Company token. This company mined at Paris Mountain on the Welsh island of Ynys Anglesey. It briefly produced more copper than any other mine in the world during the Industrial Revolution. It also used a high-quality ore from its mine to produce tokens which could be exchanged for official coin at full value at any one of its shops or offices. This made the Paris Mining Company the first company in the world to issue tokens. These were described as the premier tokens of the 18th century by that era's coin experts. Soon, practically every town in Britain was producing its own tokens. This was driven in part by shortage of government coinage and improvements in coinage manufacturing by Matthew Boulton Soho's Mint in Birmingham, who also turned his hand to tokens. By the turn of the 19th century, the total supply and fast circulation of tokens, foreign coins, and other substitutes probably exceeded those of the official coins of the country. The process of tokenization was subsequently seen in other countries, in particular the United States. Mining and logging camps in the 19th century US were typically owned and operated by a single company, often in remote locations with poor access to cash. These companies would often pay their workers in scrip or tokens. The workers, given the limited places they could spend scrips, had little choice but to purchase goods at company-owned stores. By placing large markups on goods, the company could increase their profits and enforce employee loyalty. Apparently, this is where the Welsh word trwco comes from, as in to exchange or swap. So, how does Bitcoin help inequality? To answer that, we have to answer, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is many things to many people, but let's for today just think of it as money. It has the properties of money that we talked about earlier. It's divisible, meaning that you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin, you can get fractions of a Bitcoin. It's transportable, as in it's really easily transferred anywhere in the world, quicker and cheaper than a bank transfer or MoneyGram or Western Union. Not something we often think about in the West, but a daily necessity for millions of people across the world. It gets over the problem of a coincidence of needs. It acts as an intermediary item that I can keep until I need it to buy something else. I can transfer my life energy that I've worked to earn to anyone with a Bitcoin wallet without having to get anyone's permission. It is decentralized, which means that no government can take control of it. One of the reasons that we should fiercely oppose something like a central bank digital currency, CBDC, is that we give complete control over to an outside agency over our whole lives, just like those miners in the story from earlier. Can you imagine trying to live in today's society without a bank account? Essentially impossible. And if we hand over the keys to our financial affairs, or quietly resist the government taking those keys, or fail to quietly resist them, then we are doomed to live what someone else wants for our lives. You may not have heard of the Canadian truckers' bank accounts being frozen and being treated like terrorists simply for protesting peacefully to protect their right to their own bodies and livelihoods. You may not have heard about Nigel Farage having his bank account closed because the bank didn't agree with his political views. This is why Bitcoin contributes to equality. It is a peer-to-peer system to transfer value. It's decentralized, so nobody and no government can control it. But most importantly, it is a truly scarce resource. There will only ever be 21 million bitcoins. They are produced or mined at a rate that everybody can know, and there's no way of suddenly creating more. This means no subtle theft by inflation. The value of it can't be eroded away by printing more of them. That's why allowing people to choose a currency that's not controlled by anyone can lead to a reduction of inequality. If more and more people say no to a soft money that leads directly to inequality, then governments will have to start to compete with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin works anywhere in the world with anyone. We do have to address the volatility part of the equation and the acceptability of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. Bitcoin is volatile in pound terms. 3.5 years ago, when I bought my first fraction of a Bitcoin, the price was around £14,500 per Bitcoin. Now it's around 49,000. And during that time, it's been up as much as 51,000 and down to below 14,000 and back up again. You might say, how can you say it's a store of value when the price can move so much? In the short term, it is very volatile. In the long term, it will continue to go up because the pound will continue to shed its value. The government will continue to allow inflation to print more money and essentially make it closer and closer to worthless. Interesting fact for you, which you may not know: nobody has ever bought Bitcoin and held it for more than 4 years and lost money in fiat pound terms. So nobody's ever bought Bitcoin and held it for more than 4 years and been down, essentially. I'm going to say something controversial here, so let me know what you think. Don't just stop listening and unfollow and unsubscribe. Let's engage in a conversation. In this country, we love to complain about house prices going up and how houses are becoming unaffordable. That's because we only think in pounds. In Bitcoins, houses are getting cheaper. We earn in pounds and we save and possibly invest in pounds, and we feel like the finishing line for saving for a deposit is moving away from us. That's because, in pound terms, it is. Even if we've gotten a pay rise in the last few years, I doubt very much that would be above the rate of inflation. So even though the number is higher, we're still worse off because our pounds that we have more of are worth less than they were before. A reminder, the pound has lost half of its value since 2000, and a new stat, it's lost a quarter of its value since the beginning of the pandemic. That means if you were saving for a 40,000 deposit in 2020, then you need closer to 50,000 by now. All that extra saving and work you've put in just to try and keep up. Another graph I saw this morning showed the compensation paid to employees as a share of gross domestic product, declining massively when money is soft. When we price things in pounds, it's no wonder people are losing hope of ever owning a house. I would also encourage people to question why they want to own a house, and go further than I don't want to waste money on rent and pay someone else's mortgage, but that's an aside, again, for another day. Here's some interesting numbers for you. Average house prices in 2019, so just 5 years ago, in England were 251,000. Wales, 173,000. Scotland, 155,000. And Northern Ireland, 140,000. But by now, that has gone up drastically in pound terms. In England, it's now over 299,000, which is up 19% in just 5 years. Wales is 213,000, which is up 23%. Scotland's up to 190,000, also 23% increase, and a massive 40% increase in Northern Ireland to almost £196,000. Dramatic increases in prices over the last 5 years. Now, let's price that in Bitcoin. In England, house prices have fallen in the last 5 years from 38 Bitcoins down to 6. In Wales, it's gone from 26.6 Bitcoins down to 4.3 Bitcoins. In Scotland, 23.8 Bitcoins down to 3.9. And in Northern Ireland, down from 21.5 Bitcoin down to 4. That means houses are 84% cheaper in 2024 than they were in 2019. Let that sink in for a second. Fiat money produces value out of nothing. Hard money cannot be corrupted in the same way. Things have never been objectively better and subjectively worse. It's time to start thinking and pricing things in Bitcoin. A short word on the acceptability. For most people listening to this, you may not know of anyone or anywhere where you can pay in Bitcoin. But I am actually happy to accept Bitcoin as a payment for any services I provide. Whenever people ask me how they can pay, I always say you can pay me in Bitcoin. But the truth is, in the West at least, Bitcoin is not widely used and accepted. I'm not naive enough to think that my saying that to you should consider accepting and making Bitcoin payments will make a difference. But I do hope that this has at least piqued your interest. I am grateful to Andre Jick for introducing me to the idea of sound money as an alternative to money which is tending to zero. I would at least encourage you down the rabbit hole, as is my way. I love sending people down rabbit holes and seeing the transformation when they come out. Nobody who's spent 40 hours studying what Bitcoin is, what money is, has come to any other conclusion other than Bitcoin is the greatest savings vehicle there has ever been. And if there is someone out there who has done the research and is not convinced, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Pete, my brother-in-law, I made this podcast for you. You asked me, why should you care about Bitcoin? And I hope that this has at least given you some food for thought. I only focused today on the West, but this problem is significantly worse, and inequality is so much bigger when you look on a global scale. I'd love to get into all the good things that Bitcoin is doing in places like Nigeria, Argentina, Lebanon, Afghanistan, bringing freedom from dictators, freedom from corrupt governments, bringing money into countries like Kenya who can harvest their resources into mining Bitcoin, but that's for another day. I hope I've made you think, question some of your beliefs, and if you've got any questions, you can ask me over on Instagram, @DavidMorse and @Life to the Full podcast. If you're ready to dive off on the deep end, you could download a new podcast app called Fountain. I've been using the default Apple Podcasts for so long, I've resisted trying other podcasting apps because I thought that Apple Podcasts does all that I want, but I've given Fountain a go, and the user interface is great. The user experience is great. There's a social element to it, so when you can comment on this podcast, ask questions, and you can also support the show directly there by sending me some sats. So if you've had any value from today's episode and you want to support me, then check out Fountain, and until next time, peace out.